So to shift a little bit to immigration detention, and particularly since 9/11, what we've seen is a boom in immigrant detention centers, and they've become institutionalized, normalized. They're touted as a growth industry in a sinking economy. And this immigrant detention system houses every day 30,000 immigrants daily, and hundreds of thousands every year. It's done with the logic of preventative security, and it's been justified by a kind of logic that casts Arab and Muslim men as the threat to national security, right? And even 8 years later, after 9/11, this myth still remains. So when you go to these rural communities that Tara was talking about, where these detention centers have been located, and you ask people, they say, no one knows who's down there, but we hear there's some Arab terrorists there. In fact, if you look at the over 5,000 Arabs and Muslims who've been detained since 9/11, and David Cole makes this point, that those held in preventative detention, not one of them has been convicted of a terrorist crime. Okay? So we have to think about this logic of preventative security that has guided the growth of immigrant detention centers, and also to think about as who is most vulnerable in this system. We have not only Arabs and Muslims, but who's primarily being held in these detention centers, mostly Mexicans, Cubans, Central Americans, though people from all over the world are being held there, as well as women and children. So these kind of preventative security policies raise the question of how we conceive of national security. And what we've seen in these security policies is a kind of racialized, and what I want to say as a feminist scholar, a kind of masculinist logic that guides these security policies. An increase in surveillance, torture, detention, militarization, security technologies, and all of these are tied to controlling political dissent, the kind of dissent that's going on here, right? Terrorism and immigration. These are all tied together. Many of you are probably familiar with the range of feminist scholars who have linked this process of militarization to a kind of masculinist, racist system, okay? And the ways in which we see militarization mobilized abroad in wars, but also internally to suppress any kind of dissent within our own borders. In my work, I've worked with the Arab American Community Coalition of Washington State, and it's a group that was organized post 9/11. There's a large Arab and Muslim community in the Seattle area. It's about 65,000 people of Arab descent in that area, and they organized really to provide support for that community. But I'm also interested in how the sort of terrorist debate has been used, and the national security debate, to kind of spawn this whole immigrant detention center. And a feminist scholar named Iris Marion Young, she describes this security system based on the logic of masculinist protection that undergirds the national security regime. And she says basically it's a protection racket that ultimately places everyone at the mercy of the protectors. So we have to think about how we are at the mercy of this sort of protectionist system, and how we as citizens, those of us who are citizens here, readily relinquish our rights for this and assume this very subordinate position within the system in order to feel protected by the system. Why is it that this has become so normalized in our society? Why do we accept this form of protection? Certainly, people working on prisons, immigrant detention, activists, community organizers argue for other forms of protection, right? for the protection of rights, of human rights and civil rights, etc. And this would offer a more kind of egalitarian system. But the system that we're up against with immigrant detention, and I would say more largely in our society, because it's almost like a symptom of the whole post 9/11 society, is that in immigrant detention, you have the U.S. military, you have a militarized detention center, you have the U.S. military, and then you also have private corporations intruding on a quasi-legal process under the Department of Justice. And this is supposed to be a system of justice that includes militarization, privatization, etc. This is our present national security regime. So what does this mean in our communities? Well, for the Arab American community especially, what's happened is what one organizer described to me as kind of virtual camps, because we don't any longer have to take people and put them into internment camps, but we have these widespread surveillance technologies that can keep an eye on communities. And we can sort of control the community, share information on the community, widespread databases between police, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, all of these different functions that are exchanging information on the community. So people in particularly Arab and Muslim communities, there were lots of news of, like in Los Angeles, of proposals to map Muslim communities, or for the census to turn over information to the Department of Homeland Security, which was actually opposed by community organizations and supposedly got stopped. We don't know. We don't know how much information has been shared. But these are the kind of virtual camps and fears that communities are living with. The other issue is that immigration courts are being used in this quasi-legal system, again, and you don't even have to offer any evidence. So you can accuse Arabs and Muslims in particular, but other groups as well, of being a threat to national security or engaging in terrorism. And we have the whole example that Caylor gave also of eco-terrorists. But for Arabs and Muslims, they're being tried in immigration court where you don't even need to have any evidence, really. The bar for evidence is very low. And so people are being denied their constitutional protections based on race and ethnicity. And I want to give two short cases that the Arab American Community Coalition have been working on that gain national attention, because I think they also elucidate sort of how the security apparatus is honing its processes and becoming deeper and more institutionalized.